Today on Locked On Red Wings, how Yzerman's cap management could set the table for long-term success.
You're Locked On Red Wings, your daily podcast on the Detroit Red Wings, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome back to the Locked On Red Wings podcast. We are your hosts, Brian Fisher and Scotty Bentley. I'm a podcast producer for the daily JAWWJ News Radio podcast, while Scotty's host over at Locked On Tigers, as well as a freelance journalist for the Detroit News. And on today's episode, guys, we've mentioned it a lot in recent episodes, just breaking down free agent signings, stuff like that. The cap management that Steve Yzerman has showcased could, if continued to be used right, give the team long-term success. And that's kind of what we want to lead off with at the very least and kind of break down what we mean by that. And then we go into talking about, what pieces that Yzerman has acquired will be part of this team's long-term success as well, and why that cap space is going to matter. As I'm realizing right now, I spelled salary wrong on the today's show part. That's because I was rushing today.
Good old salary, baby.
Salary, baby. But Scotty, this was your topic idea. Why don't you lead us off? Like, when we talk about long-term money, what are we talking about in this situation?
Well, yeah, I think this is a really fascinating conversation for a lot of reasons. I feel like the Red Wings are at a really interesting point where they have long-term pieces that are like locked up for a long time, and then they have shorter term pieces that could be extended, and then they have shorter term pieces that when their contracts are over, they will become free agents or whatnot, and the Red Wings will get that money back. And I think there's somewhat of a debate around some of them, but B, we talked about it a lot during the DeBrincat saga, we'll call it, right? Like, Steve Yzerman doesn't like long-term deals, and Larkin is obviously an exception to that, just captain and whatnot, but he doesn't like long-term deals. And so I think that keeping that in the back of our minds, like the anti over 6 years or whatever like kind of mindset that he has, on top of just where the roster is set right now, I think there's a lot of really, really interesting moves in the future that this team is set up to do. And it's not as player friendly, but when building a team, it's hard to deny that keeping everybody in that 2 to 5 year range as far as contracts goes gives you a lot more flexibility than the alternative.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought up the player friendly part, because it definitely isn't player friendly. Like, a lot of these guys want to get their bags. They want to get their long-term deals. And he gave Dylan Larkin that. And I've mentioned this on the show before, so I don't mean to beat the dead horse here, but they gave Larkin the 8-year deal because he was the captain. Like, he's meant to be here for his entire career, at least in theory, and be the core and the rock of the organization. But outside of that, maybe Moritz Seider could earn an 8-year contract, but it probably, I've started to change my tune. Like, the more often that Steve Yzerman refuses to give people longer than a 5-year deal or a 4-year deal, the more I become convinced that the next contract that Raymond and Seider will get won't be those long-term deals. They'll be maybe 3 or 4-year bridge deals, because what Steve Yzerman is trying to accomplish by signing these guys to 5-year or shorter, 5-year or fewer year-long contracts is to establish what I've been calling a rolling cap space. You look at the Red Wings, how many moves they made this offseason. They signed 10 different guys, and some of those guys, especially when you accompany it with the moves he made last offseason, 5-year deals, $5 million each, so $25 million. Then down from there, he spent a lot of money these last 2 offseasons, but that's because both of these last 2 offseasons, he had the money to spend. Last offseason was $40 million. This offseason was $30 million. This upcoming offseason, if he obviously has to still sign Joe Veleno, but he's going to have another $33 million in cap space to sign more guys or re-sign or extend guys that he already has on his roster. So these short-term deals he's making, and I know in the last 2 offseason he's created longer-term deals for some of these guys, but he's creating a system where guys are coming off the books every single offseason to create room for bringing new guys, younger guys in, more effective guys to make the team not just better, but continue success, hopeful success year in and year out, to just continue that roster turnover.
Yeah, and it's the double-edged sword of this conversation is for players like Raymond and I guess Sider is probably the biggest one, right? Like there is something to be said for, look, if there was ever somebody to break your rule on, it probably is Moritz Seider. And the reason behind that is you could be, if he reaches the heights that you expect him to reach and, like he stays remotely healthy, like he has the ability to give you a discount in exchange for giving out one of those long-term, 7, even 8-year deals, right? And the logic behind that is like he's still growing as a player. We don't know. Everybody has an opinion on what the ceiling, what Sider's ceiling is, but that's not set in stone. Nobody knows exactly where that's going to be. So if you're looking at his trajectory and you go, okay, well, let's lock him up for the next 7 years, right? Let's give him a 7-year deal. Let's give him an 8-year deal. Then you can go, okay, well, we'll give you more than you're worth right now, AAV wise. We will make you a higher AAV per year salary than what you would expect and that what your value is given your current production right now, so that in years 4 through 8, when he's in his presumed prime and is the best, I mean, he already is the best defenseman on this team, but is like, the best defenseman on hopefully like a Stanley Cup contending team, and is like perhaps one of the better defensemen in the entire conference, perhaps even one of the better defensemen in the entire NHL. Then you're looking back and you're like, okay, well, I don't even like calling it an overpay, but like we gave him more of his value at the early years of those deals so that we could kind of get a return on our investment. And now we're getting him for an objective discount at the end. And like, that's like the one, I don't even know if exception is the right word, but like, that's the one, I guess, counter argument to this, like, hey, let's keep everything into 3 to 5 years. Because if you give Seider a 4-year deal, he's going to be a UFA then at what, like 25, 26?
I don't think he'll be a UFA that short. I mean, the RFA rights, how long do those last, right? I mean, he'll.
Well, no, but I'm saying if you gave him, I guess it depends on how you do it. If you're extending on to the end of the RFA stuff, yes. But if you're just giving him a new 4-year contract, then it's different. But regardless, like if you were to play this game and give him a shorter term deal, whatever, you let his RFA status run out, then you give him a shorter term deal, you're going to be putting him as a UFA, like right in the middle of his presumed prime, or as he's entering his presumed prime, right? Whereas if you just lock him up long term, then you don't have to worry about that as much. So like it really is a back and forth type of thing.
Yeah, and I'm not. I know that I'm in love with the idea of extending Seider not on that long-term deal for all the things that you just listed out and laid out. But, I look at what the starts with Jason Robertson, who is a really good NHL player, 109 points this last year. And they, Jim Nill, who came from the Red Wings organization with Ken Holland, albeit, only signed him to a 4-year deal, 7.75, because Jim Nill doesn't like paying guys long-term money. Yeah. It's not in his DNA either. So I feel like that. And by the way, he'll be an RFA at the end of his contract. I believe he'll be 26 years old. So like, I'm warming up to the idea of giving maybe Seider and Raymond that shorter term deal just to continue again, that rolling cap hit. But again, you will have to re-sign Seider because you assume that he's not going to just like crap the bed in like year 3 or 4 and just become like a bottom feeder. So like, that's where the problem becomes, because if you do sign him that long-term deal, he becomes much more valuable in the later stages of that contract if he remains that good, but it's just not part of. I mean, Seider, I think, could be the only real exception at this stage of the Red Wings who would get that 8-year deal. But with the way that Yzerman's building it right now, he's clearly, at least if I'm Yzerman, I'm clearly building this with the idea of every single offseason I have room to wiggle, because you don't want to be a Toronto Maple Leafs who are like, oh God, let me look. I have it up here. Toronto Maple Leafs are currently $8 million over the cap. The Lightning are $8 million, $6 million over the cap. The Canucks are 4.5 over the cap. Like, you don't want to be those teams who are over the cap and have to sell off assets to try and, or LTIR guys to try and figure it out.
Yeah,
and
you
I think
want
Steve
money
Yzerman,
coming off the books every offseason if you can.
And like, if you look too, like the guys who are signed to those long-term contracts are guys who are presumed to be here for all 5 years and play important roles in your top 6 or your top 4 pairs. It's the guys who aren't, who are signed to those little contracts. Those guys you can replace with younger parts. Like, when you look at the bigger picture, it makes a lot of sense. We're going to take a quick break, and when we come back, we'll continue this conversation. But first, I got to talk to you guys today about FanDuel. Take your first swing at betting MLB on FanDuel and get 10 times your first bet amount in bonus bets up to $200. That's right. Just bet $20 and you'll land $200 in bonus bets, win or lose. That's $200 you can spend on everything from the money line to the over-under to who you think is going to hit that first home run. All on an app that's safe, secure, and super easy to use. Plus, when you win, you get paid instantly. There's no better place to bet on MLB than FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. Sign up today. Visit FanDuel.com/lockedon to get up to $200 in bonus bets. That's FanDuel.com/lockedon. FanDuel, official partner of Major League Baseball. Segment 2, Locked On Red Wings podcast. Scotty and I are talking about the long-term implications of the money with the Detroit Red Wings. And the next thing I'm about to say, Scotty, is going to come off as a very no-duh situation. But at a certain point, the Red Wings have got to stop taking on contracts for the purpose of buying them out. I know the Kyler Yamamoto thing, because of his age, you end up only have to pay him 1/3. It's only a little bit of money. But, you're still paying, and it's not a lot of money, but you just got off of the Franz Nielsen buyout. The Justin Abdelkader, you're still paying him another $1 million for 3 more seasons. Kyler Yamamoto, you're paying about $500,000 the next 2 years. If you want to maintain long-term success, you got to avoid buyouts. And I know that, again, I said it out loud. It's a no-duh statement. And once this team gets to being in a position to succeed, they're going to not take on contracts for the express purpose of buying them out unless they're already on the team and they're not working out, in which case sometimes, like, again, Abdelkader and Franz Nielsen, it just ends up being the right decision to make. But that is an important part of the long-term success of this team, is at a certain point, you got to stop taking on dead money for future assets. But that comes with the transition to a winning team anyways.
Yeah. I don't know if it's too much of a conversation, just because I completely agree with what you just said. Like, they are just at that weird spot where they are transitioning from rebuild to contention. Like, we're literally right in the middle of it. Like the DeBrincat trade was really the bat signal for the tides, I think, like, officially turning in that regard. And so, yeah, I think that's you're right. It's something that rebuilding and bad teams usually do to help with asset management, and it's something that good teams that need every single dollar they can in the salary cap to keep their product on the ice doesn't do. and so, yeah, like the Wings are just in that transition period. I would imagine after the ones that are currently on the books are done, then that'll be over.
Well, and they talk a lot too. We've heard a lot in the offseason about the acquisitions the Red Wings have made in the longer term range, like the Ben Sherratt, Justin Hall, JT Compher, Andrew Kopp are the first 4 that really come to mind. I mean, those are guys who are going to be here for 3 to 4 more years or 5 more years in Compher's case. And a lot of people will criticize Yzerman, saying those are really middling picks. But, you're paying those players for their prime. All 4 of those guys I just named, their contracts are going to be up before the end of their, I think, age 35 season. Like, that's why it makes so much sense to sign those guys to the longer term deals. They're only going to be UFAs and get that real big bag once, and you're still not paying them all the way until they're well past their prime. Once their contract's up, you can dump them. And that sounds so rude when you say it that way, but you can release them or not re-sign them.
We've all been.
You'll have younger guys who are ready to step up and replace them at that point. It would suck if it takes 5 years for Nate Danielson to make the NHL team as a top 6 center, but like, that's what you're setting up. You have guys on the roster right now who are in their prime, who are going to be in your top 6 or top 9, whatever you want. And by the time their production starts to dip, you'll be ready with young guys on much cheaper contracts to replace them in the lineup. It's just because that's where it comes is like, who is part of this Red Wings future? And you look at this cap situation and how it's panned out, and you can almost see how it's supposed to work. The first few years, it's all comfer. And then like year 3 or 4, 5, that's when you see Marco Kasper and Nate Danielson maybe start to take over. And other guys' roles really take a step back.
Well, that is a transition into a fantastic point that should not be taken lightly. And that is that salary cap management becomes insurmountably easier when you have a great farm system. And like that's objective. That is something that the best organizations in hockey, the best organizations in any sport that has like a minor leagues, like has a farm system, has a prospect pool. That's just how it works. Like it's significantly easier to have a conversation about not paying someone if you have a highly regarded prospect that you're like I could see this person replacing, maybe not right away, but over the course of the next 4 years, I could see this kid replacing the production of the 28, 29, 30-year-old that we'd have to re-sign right now. Like, you know what I mean? And that's healthy. Those conversations should be difficult because that's the sign of a healthy, deep organization. And so, yeah, like to your point, I mean, if you do have those type of players waiting in the wings at all times, right? If you have a couple of forwards and a couple of guys on the blue line, it doesn't even have to be, like 8 top prospects deep or something. But like if you have dudes constantly waiting in the wings, then like the conversation around these guys, I guess, becomes more difficult, but it becomes significantly easier to get over the loss and to part ways with those type of players just because of that. So yeah, like, this conversation isn't just strictly, like money long term. It's also like if you can develop talent well, then that makes it a lot easier to allocate funds as well.
Well, like this is where the Red Wings prospect pool just comes in so handy, right? Like the fact that you have a lot of guys who currently are projected to be NHL caliber talent, and you have them on cheap deals, and they're going to be RFAs, and then they'll be arbitration eligible RFAs. Like you're going to be able to continue to, pay them cheaper contracts when their production is going to be hopefully very good. Like Nate Danielson, Marco Kasper, Carter Mazur, Elmer Soderblom, Wallander, Edvinsson, Johansson, like all these guys, if and when they make the NHL, could be and hopefully will be extremely impactful NHL caliber players on cheap deals. And they're going to start bleeding into the league very shortly here. Like you could see guys like Kasper and Edvinsson as soon as this season.
Right.
And once they're going to end up replacing a roster player that you're paying a lot more money to play the game. And these guys are going to be on cheap team control. So that plays so much into this team's long-term cap success, is having players under team control that are NHL caliber players. And again, I said it at the end of segment 1, and I'll say it again here nearing the end of segment 2. It's like when you look at cap friendly and you look at everything, and you take it all in, you can kind of get a picture of like, what is the goal here? You pay guys to play here in their prime right now until the young guys who you have on cheap contracts under team control come up, and then you'll have cap space when this team is competing. And then you can utilize that cap space to take this team from a competing team to a Stanley Cup team. It's that simple.
Correct. Yeah. Well, and another point, I guess we can get to break here first, because I probably will ramble a little bit, but like we've talked about how the allocation of funds is very determined based on not only the talent at the NHL level, but also the talent in the system. But it also allows you more flexibility in the trade market, which is like another huge part of this. Like it's not all just, what's your cap this year? Like there is huge implications every single trade deadline now if you always have a piece that is available and like flexible enough to move.
Yes, absolutely. Like Scotty said, we're going to take a quick break, and when we come back, we'll wrap up this conversation on the cap situation and who is part of the future. So stay tuned to Locked On Red Wings. Segment 3, Locked On Red Wings podcast. Scotty and I are having a conversation about the long-term salary cap implications that Steve Yzerman, at least as we view it, has set up. Scotty, you had a point you wanted to get to. If you want to carry on now.
Yeah, it's just now. It's just one of those things where, like, if you have both of the things we just mentioned, if you have organizational depth and you have that flexibility of like, hey, some decent name or better or multiple are going to be UFAs at the end of every season. Yes, that can be somewhat stressful just for maintaining a core long term, but also it allows you to have flexibility at pretty much every single trade deadline to do something. And that is, let's say at the deadline, okay, we have enough organizational depth. We're willing to part ways with some of these young skaters, some of these prospects to bring in a more top heavy, like big name player at a deadline on an expiring deal. We're not paying him long term, whatever, but he's going to help us in the second half of the season in the playoffs. Let's do it. And so you have that. But on the flip side, and this is, I think, the much more fascinating part of this conversation, and one that I think Yzerman has already begun to kind of prove that he will be willing to do long term, is buying and selling at the same time. That is a very fine line to walk, and something that a lot of teams have a somewhat of a difficult time doing, or sometimes, again, their salary situation prevents them from doing both of those things at the same time, right? If you're way over cap, you're just going to say, oh, screw it, let's just go all in kind of thing. But if you have that organizational depth and you have some flexibility there, you can do both. And my point with that is, like, not this past offseason was mostly selling, especially after the Ottawa series, but like no one had Hronek really on their radar to get traded.
Oh God, that was even Yzerman said it wasn't on his radar.
Right. And so, like, I feel like you are going to be in a position to make a move similar to that every offseason, like looking at this upcoming season, right? And looking at who's under contract for then like the immediate future here. Perron is he's only has 1 year left. He's an expiring deal. Let's just fast forward to the trade deadline. I know it's July. That's insane. But like, just hear me out. Like, that's probably a little tough for you. If I'm assuming the Red Wings are going to be somewhat in it at the deadline, they're going to want to put it together a competitive product. If they're out of it, then obviously they're just going to trade all their expiring deals. But like, if they're in it, they'll probably just hold on to Perron and whatnot. But a player like Fabry is fascinating to me, because at this year's deadline, he will be at $4 million AAV. So you'll have to pay the rest of this upcoming season and then $4 million the following. He's only 27 years old as it stands right now in July. He's had some injuries. He hasn't been on the ice too terribly much, but when he is on the ice, I think he's been worth about a $4 million AAV evaluation. And the Red Wings have a lot, all of a sudden, of depth at the winger position. So you could very well be in a position when you're like, you know what? I think maybe we will trade, I don't know, like some of our prospects for, again, like some top end talent, maybe whatever you want to do on the buying side of things, but also to reinforce the depth within this organization, or maybe get us a pick that we didn't think we'd get. Like with Hronek, maybe we flip Fabry as well in kind of this weird buy and sell at the same time type of mode. And I'm not like advocating to trade Robbie Fabry right now, but I'm just laying out the point that, like, you have so much more flexibility at every summer and every trade deadline with a guy, like, hey, there's a rental or a 1.5 year rental that the Red Wings are somewhat willing to part ways with every single deadline for you.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think we've pretty well laid out the salary cap situation here with the Detroit Red Wings.
What do you think about Raymond?
What about him?
Well, we talked about Seider. I don't, and how we'd be a little more willing to go longer term with him.
Not right now with Raymond. I need him to have a really good third season.
But so does that mean you're anti an extension at all? Like, you're just going to go year to year, do the RFA and the arbitration thing?
He needs to, once he let him play out at least the majority of his third year on his ELC, and then we can reconvene and see.
Well, then if he does well, then the value goes up.
Yes.
I'm not saying I disagree. I'm just playing devil's advocate.
I don't think Raymond would want to sign a new extension right now anyways, knowing that he had a down year. I think he would want to say, I'm going to prove.
That's a fair point.
that earn more money.
So
Speaking
under
of
the
which,
radar.
I was going to say, speaking of which, that leads us right to our next thing is like what players in this organization right now are part of the future long term. Like
Right. Well,
I
this
kind of
is
listed some guys off.
right. This is my under the radar like extension conversation. We've talked about Sider. We've talked about Raymond. What do you think about the concept of giving a multi-year extension to Berger?
Not right now. That would definitely be a conversation to be had after the second year of his contract.
Sure.
He showed some great flashes, and I think he is going to be a stud at the NHL level. But I definitely need to see another year of success out of him.
I would agree with you, but I do think the conversation is somewhat fascinating just because especially if you were to do Sider or Raymond first, you could very easily go to his agent and just be like, you're not getting more than this, obviously. So, like, you know what I mean? I feel like you could use one of those two as maybe Siders is just like too different, where it'd be like, yeah, obviously we didn't expect that. But like if you did like Raymond first, you could kind of set the benchmark and be like, you're not getting anywhere close to that. So maybe we tag 2 years onto the ELC, do an extension type of thing. I don't know. I agree with you. I'm just kind of like thinking out loud. I think that there is somewhat of a conversation there.
Yeah, I mean, I think Bergeron is long term with this team. I think long term with this organization. I think he has a future. I mean, outside the guys who are signed long term, like Kopp and Comfer, who are going to be here for another 4 and 5 years respectively. Like guys on the roster right now that I see as being like part of this team when they win a Stanley Cup, Jake Wallman maybe on defense. I mean, obvious guys who are obvious. I'm not going to say like
sure
Larkin, DeBrincat, Raymond. Like those are guys I expect to be there.
Right.
But and Sider
nice
as well.
To say DeBrincat.
It is nice to say.
That's crazy. That's like still like fresh. That's just so like I don't just say that with ease. Like I still like, damn, we really have Alex DeBrincat.
We really secured the bag. I'd love to see Michael Rasmussen as a part of this team when they win a Stanley Cup. I think he has. I mean, he's not got one more year left at his current contract. He's going to be an arbitration eligible RFA at the end of it. If this year he comes out and he continues what he did last year, but can play the full 82 and just crushes it, like I'll be 100% sold. This man has a future with this organization.
He's all in.
He's all in. But then like there's obvious prospects as well. Like I expect Danielson, Casper, Mazer, Edvinsson, even Wallander, not Willander. We didn't draft him. And Johansson, like I expect those guys to be, and Sebastian Cossa, like the prospects like that, I fully expect to be part of this team when they're ready to compete. Like they have taken steps every single year to get better toward and head towards the NHL. Some of them aren't there yet. Like I think Cossa is still a little bit away, but guys like Casper and Edvinsson are like on the cusp. Johansson and Wallander are like just behind them. Mazer might take another year or two, but like I expect them to be on the NHL roster and be part of this team's future.
I do too. And I think the nature in which this team and this front office hands out deals allows for natural opportunities and natural like playing time to arise at some point over the next several years for all those guys.
Absolutely. I wanted to end on this, Scotty. So I was just scrolling Cap Friendly while we were talking, and I noticed something. Guess who got an entry-level contract with the St. Louis Blues? I really set you up for failure here. I'm very sorry.
I'm trying to.
It was somebody that we really loved last year during the preseason and during training camp.
Last year?
Yeah, during preseason training camp, we were like, this guy could like make his way onto the team from like just invite from professional or amateur invite.
Sure. I remember doing those shows. I'm trying to remember who we talked about that's not here anymore. I don't know.
Jeremy Biakabatuka.
Wow, yeah, we did, man. There was a solid group of I want to say like 3 or 4 names last year that we brought up as like yeah, like these guys got invites to camp. They looked really good, and now like they're gonna go elsewhere, and that's kind of disappointing. But like, there's no room. There's no room, and he was definitely one of them.
To this day, I am shocked that he was one of the guys who got cut and didn't get an ELC because he's a 6'4" right shot defenseman who plays right side. He's 200 pounds. Like you could stand to put on a few pounds, but like 21 years old, like this guy was everything that Steve Yzerman loves in a defenseman. He was super physical and he was super aggressive, but they cut him in the end. And I'm happy to see that he landed on an ELC, like
him.
not just like a two-way contract, like an entry-level contract with the St. Louis Blues. So
yeah,
that
good
makes
for
me really
him,
happy
man.
for him.
That's the dog.
And then also, we'll probably use this on an episode in a couple weeks if we do, Atlantic Division previews. But Jay Fresh last year, you remember he did the projections based on his model, and his projection had the Red Wings making the playoffs with 96 points, fourth in the Atlantic, but a wild card team with 96 points. It went Boston 104 points, Florida 104 points, Toronto 103 points, Detroit 96, Tampa falling out of the playoffs.
When was the last time the Detroit Red Wings were preseason projected to make the postseason?
I don't know. And like the thing is, like there are some oddities on here. Like Winnipeg, he has them projected to have 107 points based on his model. But the Calgary to bounce back to make the playoffs with 98 points. Like certain teams on here, you're like, oh, that's kind of weird. But other teams, you're like, that would be hype, namely the Detroit Red Wings. And last year, he projected the Boston Bruins to have like 130 points. And even he was like, I don't know what the model sees here. I'm so confused. And then they broke the record.
And then they did, yeah.
Not trying to say that gives like him 100%.
No, yeah, well,
flappable.
It's a model at the end of the day. Yeah, it's supposed to be a guideline and induce discussion. So
and it definitely got me pumped. So we'll definitely bring that back up. He does a couple of these every year, so I'm sure he'll have a couple more versions out. By the time we talk about the Atlantic Division, probably reach that in August. That's when we'll start doing player and season previews. So stay tuned for that. But anyway, Scotty, that does it. You have any final thoughts, man?
We ball.
We do ball. We'll be back with a new episode tomorrow. So stay tuned for that. Same time, same place. See your team every day.
Every day.